Hi, this is Guy Burgess. For this post, I want to talk about the complex causes of social problems. Now, so far, we've spent a lot of time talking about how complexity-oriented thinking can open up a whole new world of possibilities with respect to strategies for dealing with intractable conflict. The same also applies for all the other social problems. In fact, if we think about social problems as complex adaptive systems, our chances of really making significant progress towards meeting this adaptation challenge that we've been talking about go up a whole lot. The good news is that there are a lot of folks who are interested in helping this adaptation process along and in some significant way making a difference. In fact, we're a culture that tends to believe there's a solution to every problem, and if we just buckle down, we can solve it. But the problem is that we're tool makers, and we tend to think about how to solve these problems in complicated, not complex ways that gets us into trouble. And to go back to a metaphor I used in a previous post of a super complicated pool table where problem solving is lining up the perfect pool shot, and we've talked a lot about how that doesn't really work, but still that's the way we tend to think about things. Now go to Hillary Clinton's campaign website, for example, and you'll find dozens of position papers, and for every problem you might want to mention, she's got a bunch of ideas on, okay, if we do this, this, and this, and this, we'll solve it. And that's sort of a complicated approach. It'd be a big step forward to actually try a lot of these things, but here H.L. Mencken's law, I think, comes into play. And the notion here is that explanations exist. They've existed for all times. There is always a well-known solution to every human problem, at least from each political perspective. The problem is it's neat, plausible, and wrong. That is, that the complexity of social problems makes these complicated solutions nowhere near as effective as we would like them to be. So what's to be done? Well, first we need to think about social problem solving in a little bit different way. And here I've got a silly little diagram that imagines that you've got individuals or organizations or groups within a society doing things that either tend to move society towards the bad end, the Anocracy or Autocracy that we talked about in one of the earlier posts. And then you've got other folks that are doing things that aren't making things better or worse, and then other folks are doing things that tend to move society towards the democratic ideal that we at least like to pursue. And the sort of total progress of society reflects the combination of all of these individual efforts. So here, starting with a sort of pessimistic diagram where most of the activity is pushing society in a negative direction. Going back to this three-dimensional continuum chart that I used in an earlier post, a society like this with most of the activities going in a negative direction tends to produce the society down at the bottom end, the autocratic, anocratic end of the continuum. But if you can convert some of the things that are pushing things in the bad direction, so at least they're neutral, and some of the things that are neutral to positive, then you can move society up so it's a little closer to the democratic ideal. And if you can push it a little further and convert a bunch more things into green arrows, positive arrows, and a lot fewer things as red arrows, then again, you move even closer to this democratic ideal, which is what we've been talking about over the course of the last several posts. And it's also worth remembering, even if you zoom into each of these arrows, you find out that they really consist of the cumulative effects of all the individuals that are involved in each organization's activity or each. So basically everybody has a role to play in either pushing society in a positive or negative direction. So how does this play out? Take one example, the inequality problem, which is, I think, quite rightfully garnered so much attention these days. We could do this on lots of other examples, whether it's terrorism or climate change or everything else. But inequality is a good one to look at. And it's also worth remembering that it's not really inequality, but it's inequity. It's the distribution of income and wealth in ways that are seen as unfair. And this is perhaps the most stunning chart that demonstrates this that I've seen over the last decade or so. And they went around, they asked people, what do you think the ideal distribution of wealth in U.S. society ought to be? And folks said that, well, the richest 20% of the population, they ought to get a little more. They ought to get, say, 33, 34% of the wealth. And the poorest 20%, well, they ought to at least pull down a little over 10% of the wealth. And then you ask people what they estimated it was, and it was more pessimistic. But the truth is that the richest 20% actually come up with about 85% of the wealth. And the poorest 40% don't have enough wealth to even show up on the chart. And so this mismatch between the actual distribution of wealth and the ideal distribution of wealth goes to the core of why we think inequality is a problem. I did this little calculation a number of years ago, and I really ought to update it, but the basic facts are still very solid and pretty stunning. What I looked at was the income share. Here we're talking about income and not wealth. Shares of the richest 1% of the population in 1979 and in 2007. In 1979, the richest 1% pulled down about 8% of the income. And by 2007, it had grown to 17%. So for 2007 alone, this amounts to $1,100 billion, or 1.1 trillion, which is a staggering amount of money. It works out to roughly $12,000 for a family of four that got transferred from everybody to the super rich. It's enough to fund Social Security and the Defense Department, or maybe Social Security and Medicare and Medicaid, and then pretty much everything else that the federal government does. It's a staggering amount of money. So again, that explains why this is a problem worth paying some attention to. And now there are conservative explanations of the causes of inequality and the solutions or the steps we ought to take in response. And there are liberal explanations of the causes of inequality and solutions. And not surprisingly, there are a bunch of causes of inequality or inequity that are neglected, nobody's paying attention to, though we really ought to, and we really need solutions for these things. So what I want to do at this point is very quickly go through a list of some of the causes of the inequality problem that folks have been talking about, and talk a little bit about some of the solutions. So probably as good a place to start as any is the notion of a zero-sum society. Lester Thoreau argued several decades ago, and this is still valid now, that we've become a zero-sum society in which everybody thinks that the way to get ahead is not by working with somebody else to increase the income and wealth of a society and then share that increase, but actually figure out how to just take something from somebody else. Obviously, that tends to produce inequality, especially when it's factored into the tendency of wealth and power to become increasingly concentrated. Kenneth Boulding liked to quote something he called Matthew's Law from the biblical book of Matthew: to whomsoever hath, to him shall be given. Sometimes this is referred to as the golden rule. He who has the gold makes the rules. But the truth is, wealth and power brings with it the ability to accumulate more wealth and power by taking it from others. There's also another set of problems associated with the ability of the very, very wealthy to rationalize what amounts to boundless greed. The phrase makers versus takers, and the folks with all the money were the makers and everybody else was the takers, was a big deal in the 2012 election. But if you look at stories like this one on banking scandals, you see that boundless greed really is a problem, and the number of things that respectable banks do to rip off their customers is a pretty depressing list. There's also the whole notion of poverty capitalism. This is an interesting compilation of stories of things that folks, clever business models that people have come up with for basically ripping off poor people. And that tends to drive the inequality problem. There's also a sense, I think, in which money is addictive. And this is a pretty persuasive article written by a Wall Street hedge fund manager about how he'd really gotten hooked on making more and more and more money, much in the way that you'd get hooked on anything else. And one can imagine ways to try to treat this kind of addiction. But there are lots of other things on discrimination based on race, gender, religion, color, national origin, all of that, going back to this photo from the segregation era of white and colored drinking fountains. And certainly it's true that we have and continue to have problems with some groups being discriminated against by others. But even within groups, Charles Murray wrote, I think, a very interesting and provocative book that just looked at white society and documented a number of dynamics that are reinforcing wealth and power among the elites and among the working classes, or the left behind class it's sometimes talked about. He also catalogs a whole series of problems that deepen their economic inequity. Then you have charts like this one that show that over the last, say 50, 60 years, labor force participation by working age males has dropped from around 85 to 65%. Now there are some explanations for some of this. Folks are going into education, spending more time in school. But the truth is an awful lot of folks have just dropped out of the labor force, and that also contributes to the inequality problem. There is some very solid evidence that shows that married families are economically much more successful, much less likely to be poor than unmarried families. So the whole question of family structure factors into all of this. Then there's also been a bunch of interesting books and articles that document how persistent, prolonged scarcity and economic difficulty affects the way that people think and undermines their ability to plan for the future in ways that can help dig them out of a disadvantaged economic situation. And that's part of the problem. The other thing that we run into is that in times of economic stress, even for the relatively wealthy, they tend to be a lot less compassionate. We tend to be compassionate when we feel comfortable, not when we don't. And that tends to also drive the inequality problem. Then you can run into folks who talk about, well, the folks who get all of this money do so because they're worth it. They're superstars. And in a global competitive environment, there's a certain amount of truth to that. Another big driver of inequality and job loss is automation. And it may be about to get a whole lot worse, but a lot of jobs, and you can go around and look at these things, that places where you used to interact with a person, now you interact with a machine. And that has implications for inequality. And we haven't even talked about globalization yet. Once you have a globalized market, you run into what Karl Marx called the reserve army of the unemployed. You can find folks who are unemployed in pretty much any part of the world and put them in a competitive position with workers everywhere else. And that creates what Paul Krugman called a fear economy, which also runs into things. Then there are questions of secular stagnation, which is a fancy $5 word that I've never quite understood, that basically explains we don't really quite understand why the economy isn't performing very well, and we don't really have any very good solutions for this. Then you have something that you might call the Lance Armstrong effect, that in a highly competitive environment, the markets select for the best cheater. And Lance Armstrong, who won this great series of bicycle races by basically doing a better job of taking performing enhancing drugs and hiding that, was the best cheater, and he won. So there is a tendency for markets to select the most successful exploiter, especially if they can hide their exploitation. And there are questions of red tape. This is a chart that the Republicans put together. John Boehner is credited with this, that points out all of the different hoops that you have to jump through in order to set up a simple small business. And a lot of these government regulations make business activity, especially small businesses, really difficult. Then you have this notion that we live in a kludocracy, where basically all of the governmental rules of how we do things arose from very messy compromises over a period of time, and a lot of it was expedient, and it basically doesn't work very well. And that also tends to undermine things. Then you could add to this the notion that we have a tax and subsidy structure that, not surprisingly, tends to favor redistribution towards the rich. And the list can go on and on and on like this. So the question is, what's the solution? And you got a list here, and you could just check off the ones that you think we really need to solve. And you'll find that Republicans and Democrats check very different boxes, and a lot of boxes nobody checks, but maybe they're really important. The truth is that we need to check the last box, all of the above. And these are problems that, by and large, we need to work on each of the factors that I talked about, as well as a bunch more. This is something that you might call massively parallel problem solving, massively parallel computing, which I've also mentioned a couple of times, is this notion of getting a lot of computer processors working on the problem from different perspectives at the same time. If we can get problem solvers working on all of the things that I just listed at the same time, we have a lot better chance of being successful. Now, this looks awfully daunting, and it's certainly difficult, but it's not impossible. Societies have faced far scarier times in the not all that distant past. Just think about the beginning of World War II. And we're certainly not facing anything quite that terrifying, but we got to pull together and work on it. So the big question is, how well can we adapt? If we can find ways of actually making progress on all of the issues that I just mentioned, we're going to leave our children and grandchildren a whole lot more livable future.